happened in Hinckley, California. So anyway, PG&E, like Pacific Gas and Energy, they were using chromium-6 or hexavalent chromium as an anti-corrosive in one of their plants. Except that they weren't disposing of it properly. They were actually just depositing it in these unlined ponds behind the building. So once it was discovered that the groundwater in the town was actually contaminated by chromium, they held a session with the town and told them about the benefits of chromium and informed them that it was in the groundwater. However, they didn't disclose what type of chromium it was, because chromium-3 is actually something that has shown to have some positive health benefits, while chromium-6 is known to be carcinogenic. So once they were sued by these residents who eventually developed cancer and other various health issues, they said they were going to remediate all the contamination. However, it's been 18 years since then, and apparently the plume is still present and might be even spreading.
So on December 7th, 1987, PG&E actually ended up taking groundwater testing for chromium-6. They ended up getting chromium levels at about 0.58 parts per million, and the maximum groundwater, the maximum amount of contaminant in the groundwater should be, according to the United States Environmental Protection Act, about 0.1. So as you can see, this would cause drastic health effects. So this chromium-6 is actually used in things like wood preservation, textile dyes, and anti-corrosives. So, like, what does this really mean health-wise? Well, people in the Hinckley area actually reported, lung cancer, heart disease, liver failure, respiratory failure, reproductive failure, along with often miscarriages and brain cancer. So health effects are very drastic. So going on from there, how did this actually end up getting into the groundwater, you may ask? Well, these plants that they had for generating power or utility, they had these huge cooling stacks, and these cooling stacks needed to be cleaned. And in this cleaning solution ended up being the chromium-6. So what they would do with these, huge amounts of waste, they would put them in pools, and these pools would evaporate and ultimately leach into the groundwater, leach into the soil, right? So obviously the town of Hinckley, being close by, would take this groundwater contaminated and they would drink it because it's used for their drinking water. So actually this is my stop here. I'm gonna
Hey, did you hear about the remediation strategy that PG&E has implemented? Well, it's really cool. It's like a three-part strategy. And the first one has an agricultural aspect in areas of low concentration of the chromium contaminant. They're actually just planting all these alfalfa crops. And what they're doing is diverting the water and getting it to go through the root zone of these crops in a drip irrigation system. And basically, naturally, these crops are converting the chromium-6 into chromium-3, which is the natural form of chromium, and that chromium-3 is actually getting absorbed into the soil, and so it's going from its liquidous state to a solid state to take it right out of the groundwater. And similarly, in like areas with higher concentration of the chromium contaminant, they're actually directly injecting ethanol into the groundwater, which promotes the growth of bacteria, which also converts the chromium-6 into chromium-3, and then that binds into the soil, getting rid of the contaminant and turning it into a solid state. It's pretty cool. And also they're still doing like pump and treat method too to other areas of the groundwater, and they're directly pumping the water out and treating it in local water treatment facilities that they created, and they just chemically treat it to remove the chromium completely from the groundwater. And then they just dispose of the chromium byproduct on off-site. And one other thing too that I read into, apparently to divert the flow of the contaminant plume, they're actually directly injecting fresh water to provide an impermeable barrier and pushing that groundwater into areas where it can be more easily treated, which I think is a really smart thing to do. It's very interesting. Oh, this is my stuff.
So my colleagues have talked about the contaminants, they've talked about remediation, but let's talk about the people that this really affects, the residents of Hinckley. In 1993, a lawsuit was conducted against PGE for its involvement with contaminating the groundwater with hexavalent chromium. The lawsuit itself was conducted by an individual from a local minor lawsuit firm. Her name was Erin Brockovich. And she actually, the findings she made, the investigations she did in building this case against PGE were so resounding that in 2000 they actually made a movie about her efforts and her work starring Julia Roberts, which is kind of cool. The result of this case that she built was the largest settlement on record for a civil class lawsuit, and resulted in PGE having to fork over $333 million. Which is a lot of cash. And on top of that, they had to cease using all of their hexavalent chromium and all their and the contamination. But there's still some controversy. They had to pay this. It's true, there's a direct link between them and the contamination of the groundwater, but some people believe that the most toxic way of receiving this contamination, this chromium exposure, is by inhaling it. But for the case of Hinckley, these people, they were drinking the water instead, and some chromium experts, they claim that by drinking it, it's not nearly as toxic. But you tell me, how is there not a direct correlation between these people from a small local town showing the same symptoms, these same severe symptoms, as the contamination exposure itself? I mean, if they're not inhaling it, they're drinking it, they're getting sick somehow. So, I mean, if anything, this is still an issue of public health and safety, regardless of how severe it may or may not be. So I mean, PGE paid their fines, they paid their dues, but the contamination is still a thing today. That being said, fortunately, the levels are low enough that the water is considered safe enough to drink, but there's still chromium in the groundwater itself. And I mean, if you look it up today, you'll be able to find this Hinckley case study. You'll be able to find it in meetings and agendas for things such as the California Water Board Act, from orientations and presentations they've had as recently as earlier this month. This is an ongoing case. It's insane. And I mean, PGE, they themselves have said that it's going to take them 40 years to completely clean this up. 40 years, I mean, Hinckley already has shown a decreasing population. Think about it, in 40 years, they may just be cleaning up a ghost town. And this is just a classic case of being just a little, too late. I mean, I'm sorry to be pitching you this in an elevator. I gotta go do it in real life now.